You woke up this morning, made your own choices, followed your own thoughts, moved through your day without hesitation. You believed you were free, did you not? But what if I told you that somewhere between that first sip of coffee and your last scroll through social media, decisions were already being made for you, not by a person, not by a machine, but by psychological manipulation so subtle you never knew it began. You were nudged into liking something, pressured into caring, rewarded into staying silent, convinced, not by logic, but by engineered persuasion so familiar, it now feels like instinct, a whisper that echoes in your behavior, your emotions, your values. This is dark psychology, and whether you believe it or not, it already knows who you are. You were never told that your mind was programmable, not like a machine, but something far more frightening, programmable through smiles, authority, fear, and praise. From the moment you were rewarded as a child for sitting still, to the time you hesitated to speak up in a meeting because no one else did, from following trends to trusting people who sound confident, that is not coincidence. That is psychological influence, refined over centuries, now built into every layer of your life. Imagine standing in a room filled with mirrors, but none of them reflect your real self. Instead, they show fragments what others want you to see, who they want you to be, what you are expected to believe, and you, unknowingly, shape yourself around those images. Now ask yourself this: if your thoughts were planted, would you even recognize it? Think of that person you dislike for no apparent reason. Think of a brand you trust without question, a leader you follow without knowing why. Were those decisions truly yours? Here is the part no one wants to admit. Dark psychology is not some villain's tool used by secret societies or underground networks. It is practiced daily, in your office, in your relationships, even in your friendships. It is used by politicians, marketers, strangers, sometimes even your own family. And worst of all, it is used by you, on yourself. Every day, you participate in it. You justify what hurts you. You suppress what frees you. You obey what controls you. And when asked why, you say, "That is just how life is." But what if that sentence itself was planted to keep you quiet? Let that sit for a moment. Dark psychology influences everyone, even those who think they are too strong, too aware, too intelligent, especially those who believe they are immune. The truth is not whether you are being manipulated. The truth is whether you are aware of it when it happens, because when you are not, you are the perfect subject. But the real terror is this: dark psychology does not need to control you all the time, just in the moments that matter, when you decide who to love, when you decide who to hate, when you choose to speak or to stay silent. Just those few seconds are enough. So now the question you should ask is not, am I being manipulated? The question is, when? And more importantly, how much of your life is truly yours? You might think you know, but what we are about to uncover may leave you wondering whether you ever had a say at all. What if the very belief in your freedom was part of the design? Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this journey, you may see your mind not as yours, but as something carefully sculpted. And if that is true, then the most dangerous thing in your life might not be what controls you, but what you never question. They told you that your mind is yours, that your thoughts belong to you, that your decisions, your opinions, your beliefs, they are formed by your own logic, your own reflection, your own will, and you believed them. Because from a young age, you were conditioned to believe in autonomy, in the power of independent thought, in free will. You were praised when you showed initiative. You were rewarded when you made your own smart decisions. But what if those decisions were never truly yours? What if the belief in autonomy is the most sophisticated illusion ever engineered? Dark psychology thrives in silence. It does not shout, it whispers. It does not restrain, it convinces. Its power lies not in taking away your freedom, but in making you believe you had it all along. And for most people, that is enough. As long as the illusion of control remains, no one looks deeper. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The belief that you are in control is not just false. it is designed. Decades of psychological research have quietly proven this, yet the public rarely absorbs the implications. In the early 1970s, Philip Zimbardo's infamous Stanford prison experiment revealed how ordinary individuals could adopt cruel, authoritarian roles within hours when placed in a structure that encouraged submission and dominance. But the experiment was never truly about prisons. It was about the mind, about the terrifying ease with which psychological manipulation reshapes identity. Stanley Milgram's obedience study added fuel to this. Participants believed they were delivering fatal electric shocks to strangers, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. The experiment was not a glimpse into cruelty. It was a window into compliance, into how easily humans abandon their judgment when subtle authority is present. Most believed afterward they would never do such a thing again, but Milgram knew the truth. They never truly chose in the first place. If your brain can be led that far with such little resistance, what happens when the manipulations are invisible? What happens when your reality is shaped, not by orders but by cues, by tone, by praise, by repetition? The brands you buy, the influencers you trust, the people you vote for, the movements you join, the stories you believe, all of it shaped, all of it guided. You were taught to believe your choices reflect your identity, but perhaps your identity was first shaped by the choices you were given. Psychologist Burrhus Frederick Skinner once said, "A person does not act upon the world acts upon him." His theory of operant conditioning showed how behavior is shaped through reinforcement, positive or negative. Society took that model and built industries upon it. Education, advertising, media, politics, all systems of control disguised as systems of growth. So here we are. You scroll through headlines and feel outrage. You hear a voice online and instantly trust it. You form opinions about strangers within seconds, and each time you think it was your decision, your gut instinct, your truth. But what if those instincts were trained? And if they were, who trained them? Think about this. Why do we admire confidence even when it is baseless, yet doubt uncertainty even when it is honest? Why do we align with the crowd even when we sense it is wrong? Why do we feel guilt for questioning authority even when authority fails us? These are not natural human truths. They are psychological influence mechanisms, practiced, perfected, and passed on. Here's a disturbing thought. What if morality itself is not a fixed compass, but a moving target, aligned to whatever the dominant narrative reinforces? In that case, are you moral, or are you obedient? So what happens when you start to question it all? That is when the real darkness appears. Not the kind you see in horror films or crime scenes, but the quiet, daily, familiar kind. The manipulation in relationships, the control in helpful systems, the influence in well-meaning advice. You do not need to be hypnotized to lose yourself. All it takes is repetition, isolation, and reward. And if that is true, you have already been under the spell for a very long time. So let us ask something no one else will. Are you thinking right now or just reacting? Let that question linger. Let it haunt the next decision you make, no matter how small. If you are beginning to sense the weight of this deception, you are not alone. This journey is not about fear, it is about awareness. And if awareness shakes you, good, that means you are waking up. If this has made you question something inside, do something with it. Subscribe, not for the sake of this channel, but for the sake of staying conscious. Like this if it pulled you out of autopilot. Comment with what you now doubt. Your doubt is more truthful than your certainty. And what we will explore next may show you how far the influence truly goes. You live in a world that rewards obedience, not with chains, not with laws carved in stone, but with invisible cues, reinforced beliefs, and carefully designed consequences. The reward for compliance is comfort. The punishment for disobedience is isolation. You rarely question it because you were never taught to notice it. This is psychological manipulation at its purest form, not the overt kind shown in fiction, but the subtle, socially acceptable version. that hides in your upbringing, your education, your workplace, your friendships. It is not about villains, it is about structure, and structures condition you. From childhood you were trained. When you did what was expected, you received affection, praise, approval. When you disobeyed, you were not just punished. You were disappointed someone. You were labeled difficult, rebellious, a problem. That is the first lesson in dark psychology. Obedience is emotional, not rational. People do not comply because they understand the rule. They comply because they fear disapproval. They fear exclusion. They fear being seen as less than human. And that fear is enough to control most of your behavior, even into adulthood. This is how school systems function, not to teach information, but to instill patterns. Sit down, be quiet, memorize, regurgitate, obey. Every time a student raises a hand with a different question, they are reminded to stay within the script. Every time a creative child resists routine, they are labeled problematic. And then we grow up thinking that's normal. In the workplace, you learn quickly that questioning policies or leadership does not lead to progress. It leads to concerns. You learn to smile when you are uneasy, to nod when you disagree, to survive by pretending. Conditioning continues in relationships. You learn which version of yourself is acceptable to others. You filter your truth. You suppress what is inconvenient. You mold yourself into what someone else prefers, not because you want to deceive, but because you want to be loved. Eventually, you no longer recognize what is authentic and what is rehearsed. Behavioral psychologist Ivan Pavlov showed that even dogs could be conditioned to associate sound with hunger. They salivated when a bell rang, not because food was present, but because their brains had rewired cause and effect. And yet somehow we still believe humans are too rational to fall for the same trick. We are not. Think about how many times you open your phone without needing anything. How often you check for notifications just to feel noticed. How your self-worth rises and falls with likes, replies, responses. This is not coincidence. It is a system of conditioning built to reward your dopamine loops and exploit your anxiety. You are no longer responding to reality. You are reacting to rewards, and rewards are chosen by someone else. If you laugh when others do, even if you do not find it funny, that is conditioning. If you wear what others wear, even if it feels strange to you, that is conditioning. If you remain silent when you are uncomfortable, that is not peace. It is fear disguised as politeness. Now ask yourself, if your entire social reality was conditioned, when exactly did you get to choose who you are? There is something deeply disturbing about realizing that most of your identity might have been shaped, not by your soul, not by your heart, but by repetition, pressure, and reinforcement. You were told, just be yourself. But what if yourself was programmed? That brings us to a dangerous question. If conditioning is invisible, how do you ever escape it? Here is the paradox. Once you see the strings, you can never be blind again. But seeing the strings does not cut them. It just changes how you feel when you move. So maybe the better question is not, how do I escape manipulation? Maybe it is, am I willing to live without it? And that is where very few dare to go. Because with freedom comes risk. With truth comes loneliness. With authenticity comes rejection. And without conditioning, the world becomes something raw, uncertain, unstable. But it is real. And if reality has any value left in this world of illusions, perhaps it begins the moment you stop salivating to someone else's bell. But what happens when even your emotions are not yours anymore? What happens when the way you feel is precisely what someone else intended you to feel? Let us look into that mirror next. You have been taught to trust your feelings, to follow your heart, to believe in your instincts. But no one warned you that your emotions could be used against you. Dark psychology thrives not by invading your mind, but by convincing you that what you see is a reflection of your truth. And so what you feel becomes the weapon, not against others, but against yourself. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt a connection so strong? You believed they understood you better than you understood yourself. That is not always empathy. Sometimes that is mirroring, a technique used in both therapy and manipulation to reflect your behavior, your language, your values back to you so you feel seen, validated, safe. But here's the catch. When someone mirrors you too well, they become your ideal. You stop questioning their motives. You start trusting their influence. And that is exactly when control begins. It is easy to trust someone who feels familiar, but familiarity can be fabricated. This is where psychological manipulation gains power, not through force, but through reflection. You fall for a version of yourself shown to you by someone else. You see your values echoed in their words. You hear your fears softened by their comfort. You feel your desires mirrored in their intentions. You begin to believe in the bond. And just like that, you hand over your awareness. But manipulation is not always external. Sometimes it is internal. Projection is a mechanism you use when your mind wants to disown what it cannot accept. When you carry anger but deny it, you see it in others. When you feel guilt but cannot admit it, you accuse someone else. When you are scared but need control, you demand obedience. The worst manipulations are not from strangers. They are the ones you whisper to yourself when no one is watching. How many times have you blamed someone for something you were secretly guilty of? How often have you defended someone, not because they were right, but because your ego needed to preserve a belief? That is the essence of psychological influence, the distortion of reality through emotional defense. And what is terrifying is how easily people manipulate others, not because they are cruel, but because they are broken. Hurt people do not just hurt others. They often manipulate love to heal wounds they refuse to face. That is not always conscious. That is not always evil, but it is still dark. Take gaslighting, for example. The most terrifying part of it is not the lie. It is the confusion, the erosion of trust in your own memory, the slow breakdown of self-truth. You begin to question what happened, then what you felt, and eventually who you are. You find yourself apologizing for things you never did, justifying choices that were never yours. You feel guilty for having boundaries, uncertain for speaking truth, and ashamed for needing clarity. And yet, you stay because you believe the reflection, you trust the projection, and deep down, some part of you fears that if they are right, then maybe you are wrong. That is how dark psychology holds power, not with chains, but with mirrors. You are manipulated through versions of yourself you do not recognize but believe in. You are conditioned to crave validation, even from those who hurt you. You are trained to find security in confusion, because at least confusion feels familiar. Now ask yourself this: if you were raised to believe lies that made you feel safe, would you give up safety to find truth? Or would you protect the illusion just to feel seen? And what if your entire life has been built around reflections, not reality? That thought should shake you, because once you realize how much of your identity has been formed through projection and mirroring, you begin to question who is really speaking inside your head. Is it your voice, or is it someone else's echo? The deeper you go into this, the more uncomfortable it gets. But the discomfort is a sign you are getting closer, not to an answer, but to something worse. To the realization that comfort itself may be the ultimate manipulation. But who holds the authority to shape your comfort in the first place? Let us look at that next. You have always been told to respect authority, to trust those who lead, to follow orders, especially when they come from those in uniforms, in suits, in roles of power. But what if the presence of authority alone can override your conscience? This is where dark psychology reveals one of its most terrifying truths. People do not need to be forced to obey. They simply need to believe that disobedience is dangerous. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most disturbing psychological experiments of all time. Participants were instructed by an authoritative figure to administer electric shocks to a stranger whenever they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks were fake. The screams were acted. But the participants did not know that. They continued delivering what they believed were increasingly painful, even fatal shocks, simply because a man in a white lab coat told them to. Some protested, some hesitated, but most obeyed, not because they were evil, because they felt they had no right to disobey. The presence of perceived authority suppressed their morality. This is psychological manipulation at its core, not just compliance, but internalized submission. It does not force you to silence your conscience. It makes you believe silence is moral. It is easy to say, "I would never do that," but authority today does not always wear a lab coat. Sometimes it speaks with charm, it gives you security, it pays your salary, it validates your success, and with every little reward, it teaches you what not to question. In his infamous prison experiment, Philip Zimbardo assigned college students roles of guards and prisoners. Within days, the students began to internalize their roles so deeply that guards became cruel and prisoners became submissive. The experiment had to be shut down, but what it revealed was this: power is not just given, it is absorbed, and once absorbed, it reshapes identity. People in power do not always need to ask for obedience. Most people will give it freely if it means belonging, protection, or survival. This is why you hesitate to speak up at work, even when something feels wrong. This is why people obey toxic leaders, harmful trends, dangerous ideologies, because disobedience costs too much, not just physically, but psychologically. It threatens your role, your stability, your self-concept, and that threat is enough to keep you quiet. Think about how many times you agreed with something simply because everyone else did. How often have you nodded during a meeting, knowing something was off? How many times have you praised someone in public, just because they had power over your future? Now ask yourself, were you being respectful, or were you being controlled? Here lies the paradox. Obedience is not always weakness. Sometimes it is survival. But when survival becomes habitual, submission becomes identity, and that is when you no longer need to be told what to do. You do it on your own. This is how dark psychology functions in modern systems, not through dictatorship, but through invisible contracts. Compliance is rewarded, defiance is punished silently, and slowly society reshapes itself into obedience, not out of fear but out of comfort. Authority today does not yell, it suggests, it recommends, it nudges, and we obey not because we have to, but because we have forgotten how not to. Even your own thoughts of rebellion are often filtered through the fear of consequences, the fear of being seen as wrong, as ungrateful, as inconvenient. But here is the disturbing question. If your morality can be paused by a command, was it ever really yours? Let that echo in your mind. Because if someone with the right tone and outfit can bend your truth, your will, your empathy, then authority is no longer a structure. It is a virus, and it spreads through every institution that promises safety in exchange for silence. But what if the most powerful influence does not come from authority at all? What if it comes from something far more subtle? A single word, a suggestion, a sentence whispered with the right timing. Words shape reality, not because they describe it, but because they define how you experience it. Language does not just help you think, it limits how you think. And when used with precision, language can influence your choices, your emotions, and your identity without you even realizing it. This is one of the most refined forms of dark psychology, the manipulation of perception through carefully chosen language. It is not about lies, it is about framing, subtle suggestion, repetition, word patterns that bypass logic and reach straight into the subconscious. In the field of neuro-linguistic programming, language is not merely a tool, it is a weapon. The right sequence of words, tone, and emphasis can make someone agree, comply, doubt, or even fall in love. And the scariest part is, they believe they did it by choice. Think about advertising. You are never told, buy this. Instead you hear, you deserve this. That is not a command, that is a seed. And once planted, it grows into a desire that feels like your own. Or politics. No one says obey, they say protect your family, preserve your future, make things right. These are not policies, these are emotional triggers. dressed in comfort, coated in language that appeals to your sense of identity and fear. Even in relationships, language is used to control. You always do this. If you loved me, you would. You are being sensitive. These phrases are not expressions. They are manipulations, subtle ways of shifting blame, altering perception, and bending your emotions to someone else's frame. Psychological manipulation through language works because language bypasses defense. You do not argue with a phrase like "this is just who you are." You internalize it, and slowly you begin to act in accordance with it. Not because it is true, but because it has been said enough. Repetition is key. The more you hear something, the more real it becomes. Even if it started as fiction, the illusion of truth effect proves that repeated statements, even false ones, begin to feel true simply because they are familiar. This is why slogans work, why mantras become belief, why lies told enough times reshape history. Now imagine how this affects your self-image. If you were repeatedly told as a child that you are lazy, difficult, or selfish, chances are some part of you still carries that identity. Even if you fought it, some days those words still whisper in the back of your mind. And this is where dark psychology shows its most subtle cruelty. It does not only manipulate behavior, it manipulates meaning. It changes how you interpret experiences. A friend's silence becomes your failure. A stranger's glance becomes judgment. A small mistake becomes evidence that you are not enough. None of this is real, but once the right words have trained your brain to see through a lens of fear or shame, reality itself bends. Language creates loops. You speak based on what you feel, but you also feel based on what you speak. If you constantly say, "I am tired," your body will respond. If you say, "I cannot," your mind will obey. These are not just phrases, they are commands disguised as expressions. So now ask yourself, whose words are living inside your head? Are the things you say to yourself truly your voice, or echoes of someone else's agenda? And here lies a dangerous paradox. If the language you use was taught to you by a system designed to control, then even your self-talk may be contaminated. That is why silence sometimes feels terrifying, because without language, you are forced to confront the rawness of your thoughts, unfiltered, unframed, unscripted. But can you trust your unscripted mind? Or have the scripts already been written so deeply they cannot be erased? That leads us into even darker waters. Because what if the real manipulator is not outside of you? What if it is the voice within? You were warned about external threats, about toxic people, corrupt systems, manipulative leaders. But no one warned you about the most dangerous manipulator you will ever encounter, yourself. This is the final evolution of dark psychology. When the manipulation no longer needs a source, when the voice of control comes from within, when the lie is repeated by your own mouth, and the sabotage is executed by your own hand, we call it self-doubt, self-sabotage, overthinking, procrastination. But those are just symptoms. Beneath them lies something deeper, internalized conditioning, a structure of control so embedded in your mind, you no longer question it, you just live inside it. Sigmund Freud described defense mechanisms as the unconscious mind's way of protecting itself from anxiety and trauma. These include denial, repression, projection, rationalization, tools your psyche uses to shield itself from discomfort. But sometimes, those defenses become your prison. You deny opportunities because you fear failure. You repress memories because they threaten your self-image. You justify staying in toxic situations because discomfort feels safer than change. In time, your mind becomes the jailer and the prisoner. You begin to operate like a machine programmed by experiences you do not fully remember. This is psychological manipulation taken inward. You were trained to obey, so now you punish yourself when you disobey. You were rewarded for pleasing others, so now you feel guilt when you prioritize yourself. You were praised for fitting in, so now you feel fear when you stand out. It is not that you lack confidence, it is that you were taught to doubt anything that made you too free. You tell yourself, I am not good enough. But where did that voice come from? Trace it. Can you remember the moment it was born? Or has it always been there, like a shadow attached to every achievement, every risk, every step forward? Carl Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So ask yourself how many of your failures were chosen by you, not because you wanted to fail, but because failure confirmed the identity you were trained to believe in. You see, the mind craves consistency more than truth. If you were made to feel unworthy, your brain will seek situations that reinforce that narrative, not to suffer, but to remain familiar. That is how deep, dark psychology reaches. So deep that it rewires your sense of normal. You reject kindness because you do not trust it. You sabotage good relationships because you do not feel deserving. You delay progress because success feels foreign. And all the while, you tell yourself, this is just who you are. But it is not. It is who you were told to be. And over time, you believed it. Here lies the most dangerous paradox in your life. The very thoughts you trust most may be the thoughts that keep you trapped. Think about how you speak to yourself. Would you speak to a friend that way? Would you punish them for trying, shame them for dreaming, undermine them for failing? No, but you do it to yourself, repeatedly, quietly, automatically, and the world lets you, because a person who sabotages themselves does not need to be controlled. They are already lost. This is the genius of psychological influence. Once the system trains you to control yourself, it no longer needs to intervene. You become both the enforcer and the captive. So now the question is not, who is doing this to you? The question is, why do you keep doing it to yourself? And more importantly, if you knew you were doing it, why haven't you stopped? Let that question sit uncomfortably in your mind, because in the next part of our journey, we are going to reveal the full truth. Not just about the systems that manipulate you, but the total architecture of influence that surrounds your daily life. It will not feel safe, but you need to see it. You thought you were safe because you were not being watched. You thought you were safe because no one told you what to do. You thought freedom was real because no one was forcing your hand. But dark psychology does not announce itself. It does not arrive like a storm. It seeps in like humidity, silent, constant, and suffocating. This is the moment you realize it has been everywhere, all along. Your education trained your mind to obey systems before it ever taught you to think. Your job conditioned you to measure your value by productivity, not peace. Your relationships subtly taught you which parts of yourself were acceptable and which ones needed to disappear for love to survive. And your culture whispered rules that shaped you so slowly, so patiently, that you began to call them your personality. The manipulation is not external. It is embedded in every detail of modern life. Walk into a store, products are placed where your eyes fall first. The music tempo affects how long you linger. The lighting warms your decision-making. Sales techniques use scarcity to make you feel urgency. None of it is random. All of it is psychological manipulation. Scroll through your feed. Algorithms are not designed to entertain. They are built to provoke, to push content that maximizes emotional response. Rage, envy, desire, insecurity. They do not care what you believe. They care what keeps you watching. And once you are watching, they learn, they shape, then they lead. Turn on the news. Do you see information? Or do you see emotional bait, carefully framed by political bias, repeated until belief becomes instinct? This is not fiction. This is behavioral science, applied. Neuromarketing firms use eye tracking, skin conductivity, and brainwave analysis to determine which stimuli influence buying decisions. Social engineers design entire ecosystems where choice is an illusion. You feel like you are choosing, but the outcome was guided before you arrived. And here is the disturbing part. You accepted it. You did not fight it. You adapted. You called it normal. You post things for approval. You choose words for optics. You hesitate to share what is real. because real might cost you something. You think you are protecting yourself, but in truth, you are participating in a design that rewards the inauthentic and punishes the awake. Now pause and answer this truthfully. What part of your life do you think was most influenced without your awareness? Think deeply. Was it your politics, your self-image, your idea of love, your goals? Write it down. Not for me, for you. Write it so your mind stops running from the truth, because once you see it, you cannot pretend anymore. The greatest danger of dark psychology is not that it takes control, it is that it makes you feel like you were never out of control, that every manipulation was your idea, that every behavior was your nature, that every thought was your own. You wake up every day in a mental environment shaped by countless invisible forces. Most of them are not malicious, they are systemic, they are legacy, but that does not make them less dangerous. It makes them more believable. And when something is believable, it no longer feels like manipulation. It feels like reality. That is why waking up hurts, because to awaken means to dismantle not just lies, but the comforting stories that kept you warm at night. Are you starting to see the edges fray? Are you starting to feel the structure around you bend? Because if this has reached you, it means something inside you is still alive. But awareness is not enough. And the moment you see clearly, something darker starts to whisper. A question that will follow you now. What do you do with this knowledge if you still live inside the system? Let us walk further into that trap. Awareness is a double-edged blade. You asked for the truth. You began to see the layers. But now that you know, what do you do? This is the cruel paradox of dark psychology. Once you are awake, you are no longer comforted by illusion, but you are not fully free either. You are in between, suspended between the lie you cannot return to and a reality you cannot fully escape. You see the manipulation in conversations. You catch the persuasive phrasing in advertisements. You recognize the strategies in politics, in religion, in media, and yet you still feel drawn into them, because awareness does not grant immunity. It grants responsibility. You now see the puppet strings, but you are still moving. You realize that your behavior is influenced, your desires are shaped, your identity is layered with projections, and with every realization comes a haunting truth. Knowing is not the same as escaping. You still crave approval. You still hesitate to speak your truth. You still scroll. You still obey. You still pretend. Because to live in a manipulated world while staying untouched by it would require detachment most people cannot afford. Try living a day without pleasing anyone. Try making a decision without considering how it will be perceived. Try feeling completely safe in your truth. You will find that truth is not always liberating. Sometimes it is isolating. This is the burden of awareness. When you see behind the curtain, you are no longer entertained by the performance. But the audience still claps, the actors still smile, and you sit there, unmoved, wondering if you are broken or awake. You begin to question everything, including yourself. Was that decision mine? Was that desire authentic? Was that reaction learned? These questions never stop. They loop, they echo, they follow you into silence. And that is the trap. Because self-reflection, when weaponized by psychological manipulation, becomes self-paralysis. You second-guess your instincts. You distrust your joy. You analyze instead of feel. You observe instead of act. Some call it overthinking, but in truth, it is hyper-consciousness in a world designed for obedience. You are not supposed to think this much. You are not supposed to notice the language tricks, the emotional triggers, the hidden authority. But now you do, and you cannot go back. This is not enlightenment, this is exile, because the more aware you become, the harder it is to belong. The social world functions best when people believe what they are told, when they play their roles, when they participate in rituals, without asking why. But now you ask why, and with every question, a crack appears in the mirror. The world no longer feels safe, not because it changed, but because you now see it for what it is. So here comes the most painful question yet. Can you live awake in a world that punishes consciousness. Some will try to forget, to go back, to numb the knowledge, but it never fully works. The awareness waits, it whispers, and if you are truly honest with yourself, you will admit this. You would rather live in discomfort with truth than find comfort in lies. That is why you are still here, still watching, still listening, because even if this journey burns through your illusions, even if it breaks your trust in the systems around you, even if it isolates you from the crowd, there is something more sacred on the other side. The ability to choose, not blindly, not emotionally, not obediently, but consciously, and that choice, even if it costs you everything, is the beginning of something the system cannot control, your own voice. But what is that voice, really? Let us listen to it, one last time. You have followed the thread this far, through the lies, the mirrors, the conditioning, the manipulation, the voice inside your own head. You have seen how dark psychology hides in plain sight, disguised as love, as discipline, as logic, as truth. But now the most difficult question stands in front of you. Are you ready to unlearn what you are? Because everything you have believed, everything you have repeated, everything you have assumed to be you, may have been assembled by invisible hands, hands of society, of media, of your caretakers, of your past. And now you must decide, will you keep those pieces, or will you dismantle yourself? Gently, painfully, purposefully, to find out what was real underneath. You see, freedom is not a single act. It is a shedding, a grieving, a quiet rebellion. You will grieve who you thought you were. The certainty, the borrowed confidence, the approval you mistook for love, the obedience you called maturity, the trauma you called personality. Psychological manipulation has no interest in who you truly are. It only needs you to be useful, predictable, agreeable. It rewards those who play along, who think just enough to believe they are free, but never enough to step beyond the design. So now that you have stepped beyond it, now what? You may feel lonely, most do, because real awakening is not a crowd event. It is solitary, not because no one else is awake, but because most do not want to be. They feel the system is too large, the game too rigged, the cost of truth too high. But they are wrong, because the cost of truth is not your soul. The cost of truth is discomfort, nothing more. And discomfort is not death. It is a signal, a threshold, a beginning. You may never be fully free of influence. No one is. But you can be free in how you respond to it. You can be intentional, where others are reactive. You can be self-aware, where others are performative. You can build your identity from truth, not templates. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. Maybe real power is not about control. Maybe it is about clarity. So now, take a breath. Look at your life again. The relationships you keep, the dreams you chase, the patterns you repeat, the fears you bow to, the thoughts you trust. Re-examine them, not with self-judgment, but with sharp honesty. What feels real? What feels programmed? Ask yourself, what part of me was chosen, and what part of me was copied? Write it down. Say it aloud. Let your awareness speak. And if anything you heard in this video pulled at you, shook you, even disturbed you, do not run from that. That is the beginning of something vital, something most people never reach. A self that was not built by others, not sculpted by applause, not held together by fear, but discovered, slowly, in silence. This is not an ending. There are more layers, more questions, more discomfort. But that is the point. You are not here for easy answers. You are here for depth. And if this truth stirred something in you, then do something that systems fear most. Think. Not impulsively, not through someone else's voice. Think for yourself. And if that thought leads you here again, I invite you to stay with this journey. There are more truths ahead, ones that may not be comfortable, but necessary. Like this video, if you felt something you could not explain, comment what you now question about yourself, and share this with someone you think is still asleep, not to wake them, but to plant the seed. And subscribe, Not because you are told to, but because something inside you knows this path is far from over. There are things I will reveal later that may not be allowed to be spoken everywhere, but for those who seek, they will be found. You just have to keep asking, what part of me is still mine, and what part never was?